As weeks go, the last 7 days feel a little bit like one in which the planet vomited up an entire year's worth of news in a single rancid belch. There was the geopolitical wildfire in the Middle East, an attack by Ukrainian troops into the Russian oblast of Kursk, chaos in Venezuela, panic in Lebanon, uproar in Bangladesh. It was, in short, a pretty intense week. Whether it's left our writers, our editors, and me exhausted from producing special episodes to cover all of this madness. But it was also a week in which important stuff was happening away from the headlines. A week in which fascinating things unfolded regarding conflicts and places that you never really hear much about. So, rather than try and keep up with the current news tsunami, stuff like the situation in Colombia, where an ambitious plan to make peace with multiple guerrilla gangs and drug cartels all at once is in danger of collapsing into widespread violence. Known as Paz Total, or Total Peace in English, the plan is the brainchild of President Gustavo Petro, himself a former left-wing guerrilla with the now-defunct M19 rebel group, designed to once and for all end the internal conflict that has killed around 450,000 Colombians over 6 decades. The idea is to open negotiations with 26 separate armed groups trading judicial lenience for a commitment to disarm. The scope of the challenge is absolutely staggering. Alongside small-time drug gangs from cities like Medellin and Buenaventura, Total Peace aims to start dialogues with powerful cartels such as the Gaetanist Self-Defense Forces, also known as the Gulf Clan. It's also supposed to incorporate talks with dissident members of the Marxist insurgent group FARC, who rejected a 2016 peace process, as well as Colombia's last remaining major guerrilla outfit, the left-wing ELN. As you can probably imagine, that's a tall order. Perhaps too tall, in fact. Recent reporting suggests that Total Peace is now in danger of collapse. Now, before we get on to that collapse, though, we need to quickly explain why Bogota took a chance on such long-shot peace talks. And the simple answer is that the militaristic approach has failed. President Petro narrowly won election in 2022 following a sharp deterioration in security under his right-wing predecessor, Ivan Duque. Angry at the peace deal with FARC in 2016, Duque had pursued mano dura policies designed to smash the country's armed groups. Here's how foreign policy described what happened next, quoting, Duque inherited a Colombia that had seen 95% of the FARC's 13,000 combatants sign the peace agreement, turn over their weapons, and reintegrate into society. When he left office, 30 different FARC dissident groups had spread across the country, controlling much more territory than they had at the start of his term. They're not alone in such an assessment of Duque's tenure. The Institute for Development and Peace Studies has shown that violence increased over those years. As a result, the majority of Colombians in 2022 were willing to try a different approach. And that's what Petro offered. Crisis Group explains how his candidacy, quoting again, drew enormous support from rural, conflict-affected areas, in part through a promise to open talks with the armed and criminal groups. It was enough for him to win the presidency, but it was also enough to convince some conservatives to give Petro space to experiment. When Congress passed his legal framework for opening negotiations with armed groups, it did so with support from key right-wing lawmakers. At the heart of this network is a plan to mostly ditch the stick part of the carrot and stick approach and just go all in on the offer of juicy root vegetables. In exchange for bilateral ceasefires, the government would stop pursuing members of the armed groups. Those that then joined negotiations would receive lenient sentences and promises of no extradition in turn for suspending activities such as drug trafficking and illegal mining. Initially, Colombians' faith in Petro seemed to be rewarded. Inaugurated in August of 2022, Petro had, by December of that year, signed ceasefires with 5 major groups, including the Gaetanist Self-Defense Forces and the ELN. For a time, the prospects for total peace genuinely looked pretty good. But even at this early stage, it was clear that the plan was having some dark knock-on effects. Crisis Group records how, quoting, violence spiked in the 2 months between Petro's triumph in the runoff and his inauguration as groups fought to strengthen their negotiating positions, claim territory, and purge alleged enemy collaborators. Seen with hindsight, that spike in violence today looks like a warning. As Total Peace reaches its 2-year mark, the hopes of an end to the conflict seem to have dimmed. After an initial positive response, Colombia's armed groups now seem determined to keep on fighting. Here are some figures. According to Colombia's Peace and Reconciliation Foundation, kidnappings rose by 50% last year. Gunfights and illegal roadblocks have increased. Massacres are likely on track this year to equal the 93 seen in 2023, with 41 already recorded. Meanwhile, the UN has reported a 36% increase in the number of people displaced by violence. Now, It's important to note that this violence is not uniformly distributed across the country. If you visit Bogota or Medellin today, you'll probably experience nothing beyond warm Colombian hospitality. But in the peripheral regions that delivered Petro his electoral victory, things are starting to deteriorate. The southwestern Cauca region, for example, has seen a recent spate of attacks. The big question, of course, is why? In its earliest phases, total peace seemed like it might be a success. January 2023 was one of the least violent months Colombia had seen in years. As recently as the start of this year, there were hopes that the biggest guerrilla group, ELN, might be willing to lay down its arms. As with many things in life, the answers are complex, but they can be broken down into a few helpful categories: conflict between armed groups, bad faith negotiations, and the exclusion of the Gaitanistas. Now let's start with conflict between armed groups. Although many gangs and guerrilla offshoots have signed ceasefires with the government, they've narrowly interpreted them to mean the government is the only entity they can't fight. As analyst Alejandra Lopez told Insight Crime, the ceasefire is with the armed forces, but not with the community. As a result, parts of Colombia are now experiencing small, localized wars between gangs. In the southwest, for example, the ELN are battling FARC splinter groups for control of drug trafficking routes. Along the Ecuadorian border, it's different FARC splinter groups fighting over territory. Over by the Pacific coast, the ELN and the Gaitanistas are engaged in what Insight Crime calls an all-out war over drug trafficking. Speaking of the Gaitanistas, also known as the Gulf Clan, Crisis Group argues that their exclusion from talks is damaging the overall prospects of total peace. With 9,000 members and territory stretching across the country's north, the Gaitanistas are by far Colombia's richest, most powerful cartel. Made up of a weird mix of former right-wing paramilitaries, FARC dissidents, and regular criminals, they initially joined the peace talks, only for Petro to suspend their participation in 2023 after group members attacked public infrastructure. At the time, the move made sense. What was the point in negotiating with criminals who kept committing crimes behind the state's back? But the exclusion of the Gaitanistas has since poisoned the entire peace process. Crisis Group points out that, quoting here, "No other armed group is likely to contemplate laying down its arms for the duration, or while the Gaitanistas are poised to grab their former lands and businesses." Of course, this assumes that other armed groups might have been willing to down arms in the first place. Because there's another factor affecting total peace: the bad faith nature of some negotiations. August the 3rd this year saw a ceasefire between ELN and the government expire, with military operations restarting soon after. The group's high command claimed it was a reaction to the government's pursuit of separate negotiations with one of its units, the Comuneros del Sur Front. But Insight Crime reports that some analysts believe the leftist rebels were never truly serious about peace. Speaking to the outlet, political scientist Jorge Mantilla declared that, quote, "The ELN has been aiming to buy time from the very start of the negotiations." The same has been said of the FARC splinter group, EMC, after several of its local chapters were kicked out of the talks for committing murders during the ceasefire. According to local English language outlet Colombia Reports, quoting here, Colombia's defense minister told Congress that FARC dissident group EMC used a ceasefire with the security forces to strengthen their control over the Cauca province. If that's the case, then it bodes very badly for the future of total peace. Petro's entire plan hinged on the idea that these groups could be incentivized to lay down their weapons. If all they've really been doing is buying time, it suggests that Colombia's 60-year-old internal conflict could continue for some time to come. It's a fact that seems to be dawning on voters. According to recent polling by Opinion Metro, Petro's approval rating is an abysmal 26%, far lower than Joe Biden's rating when he pulled out of the 2024 race. Now, a lot of that is due to stuff unrelated to total peace. Colombians in urban areas far from the fighting are likely more annoyed about Petro's controversial health reforms than they are about stalled negotiations with ELN. Still, it creates a gloomy backdrop to the peace process. After all, if Petro tried peace and Duque tried military crackdown and neither worked, what hopes are left going forwards? Now, luckily, there are some shafts of light that can just about be seen amid the darkness. Faint hopes that maybe, just maybe, total peace isn't dead after all. The first is the ongoing peace process with ELN unit Comuneros del Sur. Although just a single front within the wider ELN, Comuneros del Sur is important because a successful disarmament could convince other ELN units to follow suit. Unlike many insurgent groups, ELN is extremely decentralized, with local fronts being given a lot of latitude to make their own decisions. So far, none apart from Comuneros del Sur have defied central command to make its own peace deal. But, as Insight Crime notes, If the parallel peace talks succeed, it could encourage other factions to split from the ELN and seek peace with the government, especially among fronts under pressure from belligerent rivals. Among those under pressure are the Frente de Guerra Occidental, who are currently losing a war with the Gaitanistas. It could be that peace talks offer them an exit other than military defeat. As for the Gaitanistas, well, just as we were researching this piece on August the 7th, news leaked into English language media that Bogota was reopening its peace negotiations with the group. While the legal framework the government might use is sketchy, and there already seem to be disagreements, a return by the cartel to talks could flip Colombia's security situation on its head. The ironic part? The cartel's return to dialogue comes just 5 months after the Colombian military started a new drive to smash the group by force. Evidence perhaps that Petro is finally learning the equal importance of both the carrot and the stick. Now, it could be that these new negotiations will not be any more successful than the previous ones. It could be that this will just be another waltz around the merry-go-round that ultimately leaves Bogota right back where it started. But with 2 years left on Petro's term, perhaps the only thing anyone can do is hope that this time things are different. That rather than collapse back into violence, Colombia's long-suffering peripheral regions at last get to experience that most elusive of things, peace. And in our next story today, we're going to zoom out from any individual conflict for a moment and take a look at a much larger entity that took a shellacking this week. That, of course, would be the global financial sector, where in a sudden, though hopefully short-lived panic, markets around the world tumbled on a scale that hasn't been seen in years. Now, rest assured, this is still Warographics, not Wall Street graphics. Not a bad idea, though, is it? So we won't be diving into any sophisticated stock market analysis today. Instead, we're going to pose a hypothetical question and then try to answer it. If a significantly larger, significantly worse stock market tumble did come along in the next few months, or even a recession, then how should we all expect such a tumble to impact the wars and minor conflicts raging around the world? And to answer that question, we'll first take at least a brief look at this most recent tumble. The trouble began after a Friday, August the 2nd jobs report from the United States, which showed much lower figures than expected, bursting a bubble of optimism that has been forming over the prior few days about the future of the global economy. Seeing the jobs report from the US, financial experts got worried that the US economy might have broader ongoing issues or could even be headed for a recession after what many analysts fear is a mismanagement at its highest levels. There's been a lingering suspicion among much of the financial world, with many American experts fearing that America's post-2020 economic recovery was a little bit too good to be true. And, well, confirmation bias is not to be messed with. A weekend-long panic had its way with the Nikkei, Japan's most important stock index, on the following Monday, and when the Nikkei tanked during Japan's business day, that panic always played out in American and European markets. To put it simply, America was freaked out by Japan being freaked out about America being freaked out, and Europe, seeing everyone else freaking out, started hyperventilating too. At the time of writing, a couple of days later, things are stabilizing. But the panic, temporary as it may have been, still exposed a level of financial volatility all across the world that's rightly got people taking notice. And according to a substantial section of the finance world, this might only be the beginning. Now, there's quite a lot of literature over the years published to explain how the outbreak of war impacts global stock markets. Unsurprisingly, the effects are usually negative. War means that national economies will be compromised and trade of critical goods might be impacted. In some cases, the effect of conflict is only a small or negligible blip, like say when Sudan broke out into a civil war or Venezuela started massing troops on its border with Guyana. In other cases, like the Russian invasion of Ukraine or the outbreak of the Israel-Hamas war, the effects are felt a little more, but in those cases, there's also money to be made. Investing in defense contractors, betting for or against a certain side's success, that sort of thing. But far less writing has come out on effects in the opposite direction, on the impact of global financial crises, both on wars that are already happening and on wars that might become more or less likely to break out. Now, to understand those effects, we've got to instead turn to recent history, where we'll use defense spending by a given nation as at least a rough analog for its willingness to invest money into conflicts. In the United States, global stock market crashes in 2008 and 2020 happened to coincide with different phases of the war on terror. But contrary to expectations at the time, in 2008, that defense spending would drop. And contrary to conventional wisdom about what actually happened, spending actually held relatively steady all the way through 2012. In 2020 and 2021, defense budget allocations actually went up, not down. But internationally, US support for its military allies took a significant dip during both crises, especially in and after 2008. Within the NATO alliance, spending across member nations was drastically reduced between 2008 and 2011, with ripple effects that lasted for quite a while, although after the events of 2020, defense spending among NATO nations somewhat increased in advance of a big jump after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Speaking of Russia, the world's largest nation by landmass is something of a mixed bag. Despite cutting its spending during the mid-2010s because of a long economic crisis rooted in collapse of global oil prices, it's since raised military spending again in advance of its war in Ukraine, even despite continued economic hardship. Since then, it started down the path of converting to a full war economy for the long term. And in the last year, China's economic troubles have driven the nation to actually throw money into defense rather than cut back. Among smaller nations, the effects are usually a good bit less nuanced. Financial crises lead to less defense spending. It's just that simple most of the time. And just as important as the effect an economic downturn can have on existing wars is the effect it can have on wars that are yet to begin. By and large, studies on the issue have indicated that although the cost of war might be harder to bear during economically difficult times, economic crises nonetheless lead to a broadly higher likelihood of new conflicts breaking out. That's a trend that has played out for some time. As one 2020 article in Foreign Policy explains, the 1918 influenza outbreak and resulting crisis coincided with several wars in Europe, while the Great Depression served as an accelerant to Japanese expansion in Asia and the rise of fascism in Germany. Even since 2020, wars have broken out around the world at a surprising rate, everywhere from Gaza to Ukraine to Sudan to Armenia and Azerbaijan to Ethiopia to Somaliland to Myanmar to the Sahel to Yemen to Lebanon and somehow even more. The aftermath of the 2008 crash saw wars break out in Somalia, Gaza, the Congo, and more, saw the start of the Boko Haram uprising and the Houthi insurgency, and arguably tipped the balance of the Middle East enough that it cascaded into the Arab Spring. Now, turn the clock forward to today, and there are a number of ongoing wars that would likely be significantly impacted if a global recession were to start tomorrow. Perhaps the most obvious is Ukraine, where despite its tenacity, Kyiv is unlikely to survive a Russian onslaught for long if NATO and Western support were to dry up. While a recession would likely push the US and Europe to take steps with its military spending in order to guard against potential hostility from Russia, history indicates that support for a foreign war, even with a relatively close partner like Ukraine, would likely go away. As for Gaza, the situation's a bit more complex. Israel would likely not have much trouble continuing to secure American and German weapon sales, considering that would be an economic help to both nations, but the degree to which Israel is impacted directly would likely determine the course of a war once a crash proves that it'll sustain past a bad few weeks. It's not clear that this would cause Israel to pull out of Gaza or even to back off of its combat operations. It's entirely feasible that Jerusalem would instead double down, hoping to put its Hamas problem behind it in order to shift into the hard times to come. And while a global recession would have effects on every nation, it's not clear that a crashing Nikkei and Dow Jones would hit all of the world in the same way. Global trade and finance makes the world very interconnected, but not that interconnected. And ironically enough, it's the same sanctions regimes that the West has pushed for years on nations like Russia and Iran that might now give both nations an insulating effect from a global recession. China's far less immune given its deep trade ties with just about everybody. But in economies like Russia that have spent years having to shift away from globalization anyhow, systems may prove more resilient against an outside shock. That's not to say that Moscow, Tehran, or other economically isolated nations might suddenly get rich, but their relative economic health and their relative ability to engage in spending on military matters can hand them a notable edge if Europe, North America, and East Asia send economic pain rippling across the rest of the world. For the war in Ukraine, that could mean a doubling down by Russia just as NATO support goes on hold or is taken away. For the turmoil in the Middle East, that may lead to a drawdown in the foreign missions that seek to constrain Iran's non-state allies. For other, less globally prominent conflicts, there are a wide range of possible implications, from the potentially devastating to the hardly consequential. Wars in places like, say, Sudan are enabled by foreign investment that makes a great deal of difference on the ground, but has a practically negligible impact on many of the countries sending it, and the economic survival of either regimes or anti-regime forces in places like that are often directly dependent on a smaller subset of economic factors. Sticking with Sudan, for example, a global economic collapse might not actually mean all that much if the price of gold remains stable, whereas a crash of the price of gold, even without a broader crisis globally, in some hypothetical world where that would happen, could lead to both the Sudanese regime and the RSF forces it's fighting against running into major difficulty. The same could be said for the civil conflict in Myanmar, the Somali civil wars, and especially the resource wars in places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where the value of individual commodities have incredible impact on the survival and, quite often, the pain of the people living there. And unfortunately, we've got to turn our attention to all the potential conflicts around the world that a recession, this time around, would potentially kick off. Among the clearest examples are a potential broader war in the Middle East, considered by many to already be on the verge of breaking out in war. So, too, would a Chinese invasion against Taiwan, long considered to be on the table, stand a chance at finally kicking off? Simmering conflicts in the Middle East already show signs of restarting, particularly the Syrian civil war as it picks up steam again, the slow-burning crisis in Libya, and the mostly frozen civil war in Yemen, where the Houthi rebel organization controls the capital and is growing in power. Ethiopia's ruling regime has been more than happy to stoke tensions with neighboring nations, particularly Somalia and Eritrea, while brinksmanship between China and the Philippines in the South China Sea could easily spiral into something worse. The Democratic Republic of the Congo faces the prospect of direct conflict with Rwanda or even Uganda over the next few years, and unrest in places like Bangladesh and Venezuela could very quickly spill into armed rebellion if a few things go wrong. Haiti's internal conflict somehow keeps finding ways to get worse, and long-standing and recently flaring rivalries between Armenia and Azerbaijan, between India and Pakistan, between India and China, and between Turkey and the Kurdish diaspora can all start devolving quickly if the dominoes fall just the wrong way. Even that's not all. In fact, that's not even close to the exhaustive list. But by now, we trust that you probably get the point. Current economic indicators suggest that, at least in the near term, the stock market tremors of the past week or so are going to smooth out. But they're an important reminder, nonetheless, that in a world that already features more than enough ruinous conflict, a crisis in the financial sector is the last thing any of these places need. With luck, the world will move forward, having fewer and fewer active conflicts in the next few years. But disrupt the whole ecosystem at once, and will almost certainly disrupt a balance that's already proving difficult to maintain. And on that cheery note, we pivot from one piece of speculative bad news to another. This time, though, the speculation at hand doesn't concern a potential global crisis, but a potential national catastrophe, specifically in Australia. The news came out on Monday, August the 5th, when Canberra announced that it was raising its terrorism threat level from its prior status, marking terror incidents as possible, to the status of probable. It was unwelcome news for one of the South Pacific's largest nations and signalled a return to an on-edge posture that it had only recently left. Australia's prior threat assessment that terror attacks were possible but not likely had been in place since November of 2022, signalling a relatively quiet span that lasted nearly 2 years. But prior to that, it had spent 8 years with its threat level set to probable. Since the mid-2010s, Australia has been rocked by terror incidents more than once. A hostage crisis in Sydney was one of the defining moments for the country in the year 2014, while the years 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2020, 2022 each saw at least one stabbing or shooting terror attack on Australian soil. The Australian government claims to have disrupted several other terror plots over the course of those same years, including multiple that were intended to become mass casualty attacks. Per Australia's own internal classification system, its new probable threat level indicates, quoting the Australian government here, there is a chance of an onshore attack or attack planning in the next 12 months. At home in Australia, government officials have been quick to put in the public relations work to try and get ahead of a panic. Aussie Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said after the change was made, quoting here, I want to reassure Australians, probable does not mean inevitable, and it does not mean there is intelligence about an imminent threat or danger. Government officials have since clarified that there aren't any clear, acute threats on an individual scale, and that instead the change is a precautionary measure meant to reflect broader changes both in Australia and around the world. The change was recommended by Australia's main domestic intelligence service, the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, or ASIO. Paraphrasing their findings, PM Albanese offered that, quote, more Australians are embracing a more diverse range of extreme ideologies, and it is our responsibility to be vigilant. Albanese and other Australian leaders stressed that Australia's concerns about radicalisation were no different than those observed across the world in other developed nations, but that radicalisation across the Australian public appears to be on the rise all the same. Now, try to think of any world nation known for its tendency towards extremism, and Australia probably doesn't rise to the top of many of your lists. But as the nation's leaders are working to explain to a concerned public, it's a place where radicalisation on an individual level isn't uncommon, and where the number and strength of various radicalising factors appear to be turning into more of an enduring problem. Per Australia's own national security apparatus, Australia is particularly seeing a rise in the prevalence of domestic actors, homegrown terrorists whose motivations arise at the intersection of their own personal grievance and their feelings on a range of socio-political issues. Conspiracy theories are playing an increasing role in radicalisation incidents, as are ideologies and belief systems that take a strong stance against authority. Quoting directly from a government statement now, the rise of individual grievance narratives and how they are expressed are impacting society's ability to find common ground. Increasingly, it is leading to a normalization of provocative and inflammatory behaviors contrary to community standards and liberal democratic values. The government points out that international terror is back on the rise, fueled in part by conflicts in the Middle East and in part by the global resurgence of the Islamic State organization and its many affiliates. But just as important is the role of social media inside Australia itself, acting as a vector for a wide range of violent, hateful, and extreme ideologies to spread, especially among younger people. In some cases, per the country's officials, individuals are hybridizing those beliefs all by themselves, growing into distinct personal ideologies that don't match the typical reasons for radicalization that much of the world has grown used to. Australia's findings are clear. The problem is much less to do with any specific ideology being especially potent right now, and much more with a critical vulnerability across the whole of Australia for, quote, politically motivated violence, including terrorism, to occur across all ideological spectrums. In Australia, the tendency toward greater homegrown radicalisation seemed to start around the same time as the nation's perceptions of the threat posed by the Islamic State organisation began to drop off in the early 2020s amidst national shutdowns and a rise in political polarisation. But a delay from the time that Australia's leaders began to let their guard down around international sources of extremism and picked up on the trend toward radicalisation from within seems to have led to that short window in which its terror assessments were lowered, perhaps wrongly. Since 2020, anti-authority beliefs have not only grown considerably more salient across the country, but they've merged with a broader trend toward cultural intolerance and ideological isolation, in a similar way to the wave of polarization that has come across other world nations in the last several years. The recent edition of the Hamas October 7th attack on Israel and the resulting Israel-Hamas war have poured yet more fuel onto the flames. Per the director of ASIO Intelligence Service, Mike Burgess, 8 planned attacks were either carried out or disrupted within Australia in the 4 months immediately leading up to the raised alert status. All 8 were planned by Australians between the ages of 14 and 21, including the only successful attack of the group, an April stabbing at an Assyrian church when a 16-year-old boy stabbed a bishop and multiple priests during a live-streamed sermon. Per Australian authorities at the time, the attack was motivated by religious extremism. Around that same time, another stabbing attack saw a 40-year-old man kill 6 people, including 5 women, in an attack that was apparently motivated by a combination of mental illness and frustrations with women in the attacker's personal life. That particular attack was not classified as an extremist act or an act of terror in Australia, but it shares more than surface-level similarities to misogynist or incel attacks that have been classified as terrorism in other nations. As for what a terror attack in Australia will look like, the government hasn't been shy about sharing its own internal expectations. Per the nation's statement, when its threat level was updated, terror attacks in Australia are, quote, likely to be low-cost, using readily available weapons and simple tactics. Australia is more likely to see attacks via knives and vehicles, as its past history would indicate, with some possibility that attackers will leverage firearms and explosive devices. As should be clear already, given the sort of extremists that we've been discussing, the attacks are expected to come either from homegrown, potentially self-radicalized lone wolf attackers, or from small groups of like-minded individuals. The role of guiding authority figures, mentoring or pandering recruiters, and established texts and doctrines on violent ideology are expected to play less of a role than they have in the past. While the government was reticent to identify individual locations, including towns or cities, that were especially likely to see an attack, it called out the usual factors that would make a target ideal for an attack in the eyes of an extremist. Crowded or densely inhabited places, easily accessible locations where the general public can travel without scrutiny, and symbolic locations that represent a certain broader target that an extremist may be trying to harm, like a government building, a religious service, or a community event. For now, as frustrating as it may be, all Australia can do is wait and hope that these fears ultimately turn out to be misplaced. Unfortunately, the threats Australia has described are distinctly asymmetric, they're unpredictable, and they implicate individuals who operate in a way that makes them unlikely either to give advance warning of their plans or to leave the sorts of digital or real-world breadcrumbs that would allow authorities to find them before they act. By Australia's own description of its anti-terror efforts so far this year, their security services do have the potential to intercept many such attacks anyhow, but whether they can do so continually is another story. All it takes is one attacker slipping through to cause incredible damage to their community, and per Australia's own assessments, it's more likely than not that an attacker will slip through, even within just the next year's time. And for our final story of the day, we travel southwest from Australia's Gold Coast across the Tasman Sea to the nation of New Zealand, where geographic proximity to a foreign war has turned into tragedy. The news broke out of the Papua region of Indonesia, taking up part of the island shared with the sovereign nation of Papua New Guinea. Positioned just north of Australia, the island's western Indonesia-controlled half holds a special autonomous status under national law. Rich in natural resources like gold and nickel, Papua province is nonetheless badly underdeveloped, owing in part to just how difficult the island's landscape is to transform through infrastructure projects, and in part due to its notoriously harsh climate across much of the year. But Papua province's troubles don't end with its difficult landscape. Instead, the most serious challenges it faces are a product of the island's separatist organization, the Free Papua Movement. The movement is spread all across Western New Guinea, not just the Papua province, but the other 5 Indonesian provinces there, all of which, by the way, are named with some variation of Papua province, South province, West province, Southwest province, that sort of thing. The Free Papua movement has waged a low-intensity war against the Indonesian government for no less than 60 years in a conflict that has seen Indonesia face allegations of genocide and seen the deaths of unknown hundreds of thousands of Papuans. It's a conflict that has remained far from the attention of global observers for most of its decades-long history, but every so often, it creates headlines around the world. This week, it did so again, when news broke out of Indonesia that a helicopter pilot from New Zealand had been killed. According to Indonesian security forces in Papua, the pilot in question, a man named Glenn Malcolm Conning, was a pilot for an Indonesian aviation company. Conning had been transporting 6 passengers, 4 adults and 2 children identified as indigenous Papuan residents to the home village of Alama, a remote settlement in central Papua province. Upon landing, Conning's helicopter was reportedly stormed by gunmen of the West Papua Liberation Army, the armed wing of the Free Papua movement and the organization that actively opposes Indonesian control of the area. Foreign pilots often come under suspicion in rebel-controlled areas, on suspicion that they're transporting personnel and supplies to support the forces of Indonesia operating in the area. Once the gunmen had taken control of the helicopter, Conning was executed, although his 6 indigenous passengers were recognized as residents of the village and their lives were spared. Per Indonesian security forces, a task force was dispatched to find the gunman who killed Conning. As of the time of writing, their only known success in that regard is the recovery of Conning's body, reported on August the 6th, along with the evacuation of a handful of teachers and aid workers from the village. The West Papua Liberation Army denied any knowledge of the incident when asked by the international press and claims not to have confirmation of Conning's death. To the guerrillas' credit, foreign deaths in their insurgency have historically been quite rare, especially intentional killings. But for New Zealand, it's both an unwelcome repetition and a troubling escalation of a problem that's been going on now for upwards of a year. Unfortunately for New Zealand, Conning is not the only Kiwi pilot to have run afoul of the Papuan guerrillas in the last couple of years. Another pilot named Philip Mertens, who had flown for the Jetstar company, was taken hostage by the organization some 18 months ago as a bargaining chip, with the intent that the guerrillas would use Mertens to facilitate their cause via negotiations with the Indonesian government. Mertens is believed to be in at least decent health and has been seen on video multiple times, but is under armed guard in the Papuan jungles nonetheless. Mertens was taken captive after landing a small commercial plane in the town of Nduga, where the Papuan insurgency is especially powerful. For New Zealand, getting Mertens back has already been a considerable challenge. The Papuan guerrillas have threatened to shoot him in the past, and the Indonesian government has had only limited success in its attempts to start negotiations around his return to New Zealand. It's insisted on negotiating with religious and community leaders around Mertens, rather than speaking with the Papuan rebels directly or attempting to launch a military operation in the highlands where Mertens is believed to be kept in captivity. There were, at least for a while, positive indicators that Mertens might have been able to come home in the next few weeks. Just days prior to the Papuans' killing of the helicopter pilot this week, audio recordings from a spokesman of the organization indicated the group's agreement to free him within a time frame of about 2 months. But even before the death of Conning this week, the idea that the Papuan rebels should be taken at their word about releasing Mertens is an idea that's only gained limited traction. 6 months prior, the guerrillas had made a similar pledge, but ultimately took no action to return Mertens to his country. Its ongoing hostage situation has put New Zealand in a difficult position around the insurgency, a conflict where, by all accounts, Wellington would rather not have any involvement at all. New Zealand is not known for having much of an inclination to get involved in foreign wars. Most of its troop contributions to global security efforts involve troop numbers in the single digits, and the largest of the bunch, a deployment in South Korea, is expected to swell in the coming years to a grand total of 53. It's a nation distinctly opposed to actively taking part in conflict, facing no large-scale threats that would prompt any engagement in a national defense, and its military force, long described as a, quote, credible minimum force that basically serve as a token homeland defense apparatus, has long faced allegations of being too small to even do the bare minimum. It's done recent peacekeeping in East Timor, Bougainville, and the Solomon Islands, but it's unclear that the nation has the military personnel or logistical capabilities required to go in and get Mertens out, even if it chose to do so. Its premier combat unit, the New Zealand Special Air Service, is thus far not believed to have been deployed to help in Papua, despite its reportedly capable personnel and its self-stated aptitude in operating across the dense jungles of the Indo-Pacific. Its diplomatic efforts to get Mertens back appear to have failed, and it apparently lacks the ability to impose its diplomatic will on Indonesia to negotiate on New Zealand's behalf. All this after New Zealand had reason to take decisive action back in 2020 when a New Zealand miner was shot and killed, but so far New Zealand's posture has remained unchanged. Now, with the sudden death of another Kiwi in Papua, it's hard to say whether there's any chance of Mertens being released in the near future, or whether his life too may be at risk. The hostage situation and the death of the second Kiwi pilot come at a moment when the West Papua Liberation Army is growing in strength. Over the last several years, the insurgents have come into possession of considerably better weapons using a complex financial scheme in order to purchase guns off the black market. Per Indonesian officials, the rebels have become proficient in using so-called village funds to capture government aid money, which is then diverted to the rebels and used to facilitate all sorts of acquisitions. Because of the rugged, densely forested Papuan landscape, it makes little sense for the rebels to invest in anything bigger than a mortar or a shoulder-fired rocket launcher, but in lands they know very well, those smaller weapons are quite clearly enough to do the job. Rebels have been pictured with RPGs, heavy machine guns, and weapons traced back to Indonesian arms manufacturers, and their conduct in battle suggests that their old struggles with finding enough ammunition have now been resolved. Said one expert on the conflict, when speaking to Reuters, quote, "Gone are the days that the Papuan rebels would save precious bullets. Now they can shoot for days." The insurgency has escalated quickly over the last few years as a combination of cooperative local leaders and corrupt military and police officers on the island have granted them increased autonomy in the lands they call home. The rebels have found increasing support among the local population, especially after 2019, when a wave of protests called out harassment against Papuan students in East Java by police. Those protests turned violent, ultimately leading to the deaths of 33 people in an incident that saw many young Papuans actively engage with the insurgency in their homeland for the first time. 2024 has seen rebel factions launch large attacks on villages, burn and assault public buildings and tourist destinations, and engage in multiple instances of torture against their adversaries. Meanwhile, peaceful acts of civilian protest continue to draw heavy-handed retaliation from Indonesian authorities, including widespread police brutality and extended prison sentences. Indonesia is intent on keeping hold of the provinces, as in the event that West New Guinea could eventually be pacified, the island's wealth of natural resources will be available for the taking. A United Nations panel of experts called for urgent humanitarian intervention in the conflict in 2022, citing, quote, "shocking abuses against indigenous Papuans, including child killings, disappearances, torture, and mass displacement of people." As of now, though, no such intervention has taken place, and although the rebels are still widely understood to be a long way off from actually defeating the forces of Jakarta, the conflict shows no signs of stopping. 60 years into a ruinous civil war, the guerrillas of Papua show no signs of giving up, and the nations of the region, Indonesia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, Australia, and others, have shown no signs of being able to bring the conflict to a peaceful resolution.